You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guest today is Ambassador Tod Sedgwick, U.S. Ambassador to Slovakia from 2010 to 2015. Prior to his diplomatic service, he had a distinguished career as an entrepreneur, including launching leading publishing companies covering energy, defense, and the environment. Currently, he serves on the board of the Center for the Study of Congress, along with the board of the Foreign Policy for America, as well as on the Ambassadorial Advisory Committee of the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Sedgwick, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim. It's my pleasure.
I think most people know that Slovakia is one of the four frontline states in NATO in relation to Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. But Slovakia sometimes doesn't get as much attention as some of the other frontline states.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about how Slovakia is similar to Poland, Hungary, Romania, and how it's different.
Well, it's a great question. You know, people think of Eastern Europe or Central Europe or however people want to call it, but it's really impossible to generalize about the region because each country has a different experience, a different history, a different approach. And so I think the big difference between Slovakia and the other countries is that Slovakia is basically a new country. It was just created in 1993. And so it's not a very, and a lot of the other countries in that area, including the Eastern Central Europe and the Balkans, they think back when their country was at its apogee. They want to be where they were, 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago or 200 years ago. Well, Slovakia is not burdened by that history. So it has a different outlook from the other one, from the other countries. But they're a very good ally of the United States and the EU and Europe. And I mean, like all the countries, there are elements within the country that are neo-Nazi, friendly to Russia, but most of the population is loyal to, dedicated to the transatlantic relationship.
Well, Slovakia is a new country in the sense that it was part of Czechoslovakia until 1993, but the Slovaks have been around for a long time.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about Slovaks before there was Slovakia.
Well, the Slovaks in the background under the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy is the Slovakia, and the Slovaks were actually part of the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and so they were oriented toward Budapest for literally 1,000 years, whereas Czech Republic were always oriented toward Vienna, and they always had a better education system, more advanced, and so forth. And then after World War I, Slovakia didn't have enough juice on its own to make the argument that it should be a country, independent country, but they didn't want to be part of Hungary because the Hungarians had become, although they had gotten along fine for 1,000 years, at the late 19th century, the Hungarians became very nationalistic. And if you wanted to advance in Hungary, you had to learn Hungarian. And my theory is that Hungarian is such a difficult language that a third of the population emigrated to the United States.
Just English was easier.
I don't know if that's true or not, but that's my own. The emigration to the United States in the late 19th century, the early 20th century is very significant.
In addition to being part of one country for decades in the 20th century, what do the Czechs and the Slovaks have in common, and what are their differences besides one was oriented towards Budapest and one was oriented towards Vienna before that?
Yeah, I think that the reason that they got together after World War I was that the Czechs are fellow Slavs, but the language, there are different Slavic language groupings in Eastern Central Europe. So there's the Northern Slavic language group, which is Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Then there's the Southern Slavic language group, with all the Balkan countries and so forth. So Czech and Slovak are not are different languages, but when I would go to Prague, I would recognize a lot of the words. But and actually the Slovaks and the Czechs get along very well. They really it was the so-called velvet divorce, so-called because it was friendly and mutually agreed upon. There were no shots fired or anything, so they get along very well with each other.
That's pretty unusual in the world.
Yeah, and
countries coming apart peacefully.
The Slovaks are more religious too. The more Catholic, 60% or so Catholic, and the Czechs have a more kind of agnostic background, starting from Jan Hus and so forth.
I see. So the religious differences, but not strong religious tensions, it sounds like.
They never fought about it, yeah.
Well, that's unusual in the world too. It's good. It's good. So let's now talk about the current situation with Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Slovakia is a frontline state. What have been the impact? Let's start. What are the impacts on Slovakia so far of the war in Ukraine?
Well, they've had the war is primarily on the eastern end of Ukraine. So Ukraine's a very large country. So there are no conflicts that are very close to Slovakia, and Slovakia has a very small border with Ukraine. It's something like 40 kilometers or less, but it's a very significant border. And the main effect on Slovakia has been the migration of the refugees, probably about 300,000 into Slovakia. And it's really heartening to see the Poles and the Czechs and the Romanians and others, Hungarians, take in these refugees. And I don't believe that they even have barracks for them. People just take them into their homes.
Well, what's the population of Slovakia?
It's about 5.5 million.
So 300,000 refugees in a population of 5 million is material.
It is.
Now, have most of those been coming through Slovakia and moving farther west in Europe, or many of them have been staying in Slovakia for the time being?
It's both and. I can't tell you a percentage, but a lot of them have been moving on, but a significant number remain in Slovakia. And some of them have gone back, to Kyiv or the areas where they were worried there was fighting, but many of them have returned. But Slovakia is still holding quite a few of them.
How about the impact on energy, on the economy?
Well, Slovakia, the concern in that region is the heavy dependence on natural gas. And that's not as much of a concern in Slovakia, because Slovakia is primarily a nuclear power country. It's almost 70% nuclear. But that raises another point that a lot of people don't pay attention to, which is that their nuclear fuel comes from Russia. And so they really need to diversify away from Russian nuclear fuel. So apparently they've got about 1.5 years worth of storage of nuclear fuel, so they can last for a while. So they've got 18 months, more or less, to find other sources of nuclear fuel. And so they're right now heavily engaged with different companies like Westinghouse and others to test their nuclear fuel so they can diversify and get other sources.
You're a real energy expert as well as a diplomatic expert.
Well, expert would be stretching it, I would say. But,
well, no, you know a lot. Basically, this is a Soviet-era nuclear reactor, and that's why it is dependent on Russian fuel. Is that the essence of the science?
That's right.
And how hard it is to switch to other kinds of fuel?
Well, you're getting beyond my expertise, but I'm told that it would take. It's a question of testing I don't think that from what I understand, the science is the hardware of the nuclear power plant does not have to be changed, altered, but the fuel has to be tested and become appropriate. And they've been using this, and it's the same issue with oil. Actually, they have a huge refinery in Bratislava that takes in Russian oil, and so that refinery has to, again, the European Union allowed them to dodge the sanctions for another 18 months and look for other sources for oil. So it's the same kind of issue, but as I understand it, they just have to test in both cases. They just have to, it's more, actually, there are some adjustments in the refinery that have to be made physically, but in the case of nuclear, it's more a question of just testing the nuclear fuel, which they're engaged in right now.
So they're not as dependent on gas as other European countries are. They are dependent on the nuclear fuel, and they are dependent on the oil for their refinery, both with supplies from Russia. The sanctions have not been applied yet. Has Russia done anything to cut off the supply on their own initiative yet?
Not that I'm aware of. It's interesting because when I was there, I was concerned about exactly that. And because I was there from 2010 to 2015, and before that, I think it was 2008, they did cut off the gas. And for example, U.S. Steel in the eastern part of the country had to shut down. And when a steel plant shuts down, it's very painful for it to, you can't just throw a switch and start it up again. It's very difficult to restart a steel plant. So it was really kind of a traumatic thing for the country at that time. And so I was concerned about that when I got there, and I worked with the Slovaks, and they were very clever to come up with an idea of taking Russian gas, and the largest compressor station for gas in Europe is in the eastern part of the country in a place called Velika Kapushani, not far from the Ukrainian border. And they take title to the gas there. And there was I went out there, and there's a coal-fired power plant there. There used to be a gas-fired plant. And the pipeline for the gas-fired plant ran very close to the compressor station. So what they did was they renovated that pipeline and built a little spur line to that pipeline so they could take Russian gas and actually reverse flow it back to Ukraine. And that's still happening. And so it's ironic that and this is interesting that when I was there, there was a prime minister who was a kind of left-wing prime minister who was, tried to be friends with everybody, United States, China, Russia. And he would tell me, well, the Russians liberated our country, and there's a lot of the population in the East that is sympathetic of the Russians because they freed us from the Nazis. And so Washington got angry at him because he would fly off to Moscow and meet with Putin and so forth. But at the same time, he had the courage to reverse flow gas back into Ukraine, which must have irritated Vladimir Putin.
Gotcha. Interesting.
So that's still going on.
So you mentioned that they've gotten exemptions from the EU sanctions. On a broader political basis, have they been generally supportive of the EU sanctions policies? For example, the new proposal to put a cap on Russian energy export prices. Have they generally been supporters of that, or there's some countries that are a little more outliers?
Yeah, they definitely have been generally supportive. And in fact, today their parliament ratified the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO.
Ah.
And so they were one of the three remaining countries, Hungary and Turkey and Slovakia. And so now it's down to two. I remember when I was back in the previous, when Russians invaded in 2014, the sanctions became a big issue because the prime minister, as I say, he was somewhat often sympathetic to the Russians, and he would go around the country railing against the sanctions.
Ah.
But then, because they're part of the EU, he didn't want to be the only country in the EU. I got a lot of calls from Washington saying, are they going to vote for sanctions? And they ended up voting with the consensus, because the EU is a very consensus-driven organization. And so he would publicly rail against sanctions, but then in Brussels, they would vote for them. In favor of the sanctions. But now they've got much more of a pro-EU, pro-Western government, so that they don't have any problem with the sanctions.
how much of the policies towards the EU and towards NATO and towards the United States, frankly, in Slovakia are driven by public opinion? I mean, what's the attitude of the average Slovak about the EU, NATO, the US?
Well, I think that they've got, well, you talk about the average Slovak as opposed, they have a very sophisticated foreign policy establishment that is very educated. They have this second largest security conference, the one next to Munich in Europe, and they have a lot of big thinkers who are very pro-US, pro-EU, and the foreign ministers are always very helpful and very aligned with our EU and NATO interests. The average Slovak, you know, I remember there were surveys taken by the German Marshall Fund in Slovakia, and they say, well, do you want NATO security? And they say, oh yeah, we all want NATO security. And then they would ask, well, are you willing to spend more on defense? They said, no, we don't want to spend any more on defense. So it was, but I will say that at the time that 10 years ago or so, when I first got there, their defense spending was 1% of GDP. And they're right now very close to 2%. And in fact, next year, they're going to be 2.1%. So I do think they see the Russian threat and they want to respond to that. You know, not everybody. As I say, in the eastern part of the country, they're sometimes more sympathetic to the Russians. And there's huge Russian propaganda, as you might imagine, all over the country. You know, phony websites and, you know, tremendous, you know, propaganda.
Given the mixed history of Russia in relation to Slovakia, obviously, therefore, there's some sympathetic reaction to that. But is there also a cynicism about the Russians in terms of, you know, ordinary people believing and understanding that there's a lot of propaganda that isn't true?
Yeah, I think a lot of people see through it. But on the other hand, there are cultural issues which favor the Russians. You know, there are a lot of, you know, as I say, Slovakia is a very Catholic country. So when you look at some of the cultural issues like gay marriage and so forth, the Russians are always sending down these preachers and propagandists who talk about how the West is decadent and, you know, because they favor gay marriage and so forth. And the Russian Orthodox Church forbids that. And so they play on that cultural
Interesting
divide. And so that, you know, it's a mixed picture, but most people are cynical about it and don't favor the Russians. But there is, you know, something that politicians have to deal with for sure.
Let's talk about defense, which is what NATO is about. And this is a war that's going on in Ukraine. Where does Slovakia fit into the NATO support for Ukraine?
Well, their support is, I would say, very robust. They're sending this S-300 anti-missile system into Ukraine, which I'm told is the largest, size-wise, the largest contribution of any NATO country. And now the U.S. has backfilled the Slovak air defenses with Patriot missiles so that they can defend their airspace. And S-300s, the Ukrainians, you know, have experience operating those, so it's very helpful. Plus, they've sent 4 howitzers and MiG-29s, Mi-24 attack helicopters, demining equipment, you know, across the board. And plus, they can repair. They have very good repair facilities, so they can repair old Russian equipment there too.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so they're very helpful in that regard.
So when Czechoslovakia broke up, they had one army. How did they break up one army into 2 armies? Any idea?
Geographically, I mean, they just you know, had a certain number of you know, one of the reasons for the breakup was that Slovakia had a lot of the defense facilities in their country, and Václav Havel was a man of peace. He wanted to get rid of all the military installations. And the Slovaks said, "Hey, wait a minute, these are our jobs."
Oh,
And so
that's interesting. So more of the defense establishment was in Slovakia during
yeah,
Czechoslovakia.
just in terms of the munitions plants and so forth.
I see.
And
So that would help explain the relative military strength of Slovakia.
yeah. Plus, they have really excellent quality special forces. It's not a large special forces unit, but it's very very effective and very helpful in Afghanistan and Iraq. Another Admiral McRaven came and wanted a partnership with them, and we do a lot of training with them. And but they've been very good about modernizing their military, particularly the air part of the military. They've gotten off of Russian helicopters using Black Hawks. They're using foreign military sales. They're getting F-16s, and most of the old Russian stuff anymore is with the land forces, the tanks and so forth. But now they're trying to get procurement for German tanks, and they're trying to get off of Russian equipment. And as I say, their defense spending is going up to 2% of GDP, and of that, 20 to 30% annually is geared to acquiring new equipment. So that's really great.
Interesting. Is there in Poland and in Romania, there are basically NATO bases that have been established over recent years, where foreign troops are not lodged there, but they rotate in and out. Is there an equivalent NATO presence in Slovakia?
There is a presence. I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's a base, but they have soldiers there, so it must be a base of some kind, depending on how you define a base. But yes, just recently, and I think there's some mixed. I know that was very controversial politically. There were some parties that didn't want NATO soldiers in Slovakia and so forth, and but I think that the politicians were able to get that through Parliament. So most of the people, it's divided opinion, but most of the people approve of them.
Interesting. Let me ask you one last question, then we'll wrap this up. Is different countries have people from different countries have different perspectives on how the war in Ukraine is going and how it will end. I was on an interview with a Ukrainian director, actually, at the IMF, who was very enthusiastic, like President Zelensky is, and many Ukrainians are, about they're going to win, and winning to them means pushing the Russians back to the legitimate borders. And in the course of his enthusiasm, he said, by the time this war is over, NATO's going to want to join Ukraine, not Ukraine join NATO. I'm curious. And of course, Henry Kissinger has sort of implied, let's make a deal now with the Russians. And so there are a lot of opinions on that. I'm just curious, the Slovakian leadership, and obviously they don't all agree, but from the perspective of Slovakian leadership, do they see this getting worse, getting better? Do they think this will be this will be a decades-long problem? What's their perspective? They're closer to the action than we are.
Yeah, I think that depends on who you talk to over there, but I think that most of the consensus there is that we're in this for the long haul, but we have to help because we're a frontline neighbor, and if we don't stop them in Ukraine, they'll continue. I don't think anyone really expects Russia to invade any NATO country, but you never know. And so I think they're not so outspoken about it, I would say, because they don't want to poke the Russian bear too hard. And but they're being very helpful. Their support is extremely robust. And I think that I wish that Washington would Slovakia is, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's a little it's overlooked country, and they've been a great ally, and I hope Washington can pay more attention to them.
On that note, Ambassador Sedgwick, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate it.
This is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe for American Ambassadors Live podcast.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.